Welcome to Glucksman Ireland House. Those of you who haven't been here before, this is the university's centre, interdisciplinary centre for the study of Ireland, Irish American, Irish diaspora. My name is Kevin Kenny and I'm the director here, so welcome to this very special Friday afternoon event. My colleague Miriam Lyon-Gray asked me to draw attention to the American Journal of Irish Studies, which is actually a journal we put out here on the house. You'll see copies on the desk, you'll see copies downstairs. Help yourself if you're interested. There's always some very fine writing in it, and actually this issue opens with an interview with Colin Toby, which you may enjoy. So we are delighted this afternoon to host what promises to be a memorable panel discussion on Margaret Kelleher's latest book, The Maamtrasna Murders, which, as its subtitle explains, is a story of language, life and death in 19th century Ireland. And our panelists will each offer some relatively brief remarks about the book, which will then open up onto a discussion on the panel and, most importantly, with the audience. We'd love to get a conversation going with everybody here. So I will introduce the panelists in the order that they will speak, and then I just want to offer, after I do that, I want to say a few brief words of my own about the book. So our first speaker will be Carolyn Conboy, who is right here to my left. Carolyn is an attorney at law. She is the great-granddaughter of Miles Joyce, whose tragic story stands at the heart of the Maamtrasna Murders. And in the 1920s, her father, John Conboy, the grandson of Miles Joyce, the son of Miles' daughter, Moira, moved to the United States, where he and his wife raised 7 children. On August 18, 2018, in Galway City, President Michael D. Higgins presented Carolyn and her sister Alice with a copy of the pardon awarded posthumously to their great-grandfather, who was wrongly convicted and executed in December 1882. So we are especially pleased to welcome Carolyn and a number of her family members here today as special guests, including the granddaughter of Carolyn's cousin, Jimmy Joyce. Do I have that right?
Martin Joyce's progeny, Emily Joyce, is here with us. She's in the back. Stand up now there, Emily. She's Johnny Joyce's granddaughter. That's the progeny of Martin.
Johnny Joyce's granddaughter.
Martin, who was out of the house on the night of the
And Johnny Joyce, as Carolyn will explain, played a key part in the exoneration of her ancestor. Secondly, my colleague Nicholas Wolfe is a research data management librarian here at NYU, affiliated faculty member in Glucksman Ireland House. Nick has a PhD in history with research specialties in Irish and British history, digital history and historical research data. He specialises in the cultural history of Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries, and in particular the causes and ramifications of the decline of the Irish language. And Nick is the author of An Irish-Speaking Island, State, Religion, Community and Linguistic Landscape in Ireland, 1770 to 1870. Maureen Murphy. Oh, so Margaret, you did set this up in sequence. Very good. Maureen Murphy, long-standing friend of Ireland House, is Professor Emerita of Teaching, Learning and Technology at Hofstra University, a renowned specialist on Irish and Irish American history. She has served as president of the American Conference for Irish Studies and as chair of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures. She also served, as many of you know, as the director of the Great Irish Family Curriculum Project, and she has authored numerous, too many articles to mention in her field. Next to Maureen is James Shapiro, the Larry Miller Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia, one of the world's leading authorities on Shakespeare. His books include Rival Playwrights, Marlowe, Johnson, Shakespeare, Shakespeare and the Jews, 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare, and he is currently working on a book, Shakespeare in a Divided America. Professor Shapiro serves on the board of directors of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, so welcome to Ireland House. Colin Tobin is the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia, a renowned novelist, short story writer, essayist, playwright, journalist, critic, and poet. He is the author of 9 acclaimed novels. He has served as Professor of Creative Writing at Manchester, Stanford, Princeton, and the University of Texas at Boston. If I tried to list all of Colin's works, let alone his honours, we would have no time left for the programme. So I will simply say, Colin, welcome back to Ireland House. And finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce Margaret Kelleher, the reason we are gathered here today. Margaret is Professor and Chair of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at University College Dublin, the author of several books, including The Feminisation of Famine, with Philip O'Leary, The Cambridge History of Irish Literature, and then most recently our text for today, The Maamtrasna Murders, which was awarded the Michael J. Durkin Prize for Books in Language and Culture by the American Conference for Irish Studies. Margaret has been a visiting scholar all over the world, and we're especially pleased to have her as a Fulbright visiting scholar at NYU this semester. Okay, so lengthy introduction, my apologies. I will offer brief remarks just for a few minutes. I loved this book, and I want to offer a few remarks from my perspective as a historian. The Maamtrasna Murders is a brilliantly crafted and powerfully written piece of cultural and social history. And really, once you open it, you're immediately drawn into an extraordinary story. Margaret, I think, achieves this effect through historical analysis at its most imaginative and creative. It is in part a micro-history, uncovering the social rules and rituals of a remote and isolated region. But remote and isolated regions, as Margaret acutely observes, are neither remote nor isolated to those who live in them. And her book reveals the inner workings of one such community in the west of Ireland. The book also departs deliberately from the strict conventions of microhistory to embed its narrative in a national story, compellingly structured around the theme of language change. In Margaret's telling, the transition from Irish to English emerges as a jagged, uneven process, marked by distinctions not only of class and gender, but more surprisingly, distinctions within generations in ways that defy easy explanation. I was reminded more than once in reading this book of the Molly Maguires, one of the last of the secret societies that engaged in violent agrarian protest in the Irish countryside in the century after the 1760s. The Molly Maguires wore long gowns, painted their faces in black or white, and threaded branches through their hair, partly for purposes of disguise, but also to pledge their allegiance to the mythical woman who symbolized their struggle against injustice. The White Boys and the Lady Clares derive their names from similar underground practices. Now, there are men in blackface and white vests in Margaret's story, and the very practice of blacking up, which in the Irish case had none of the valences of American minstrelsy, invalidates a key piece of eyewitness evidence in the case. How can you identify somebody whose face you cannot see? In Pennsylvania, the Molly Maguires re-emerged as a rare transatlantic outgrowth of an Irish rural tradition. 20 of them went to the scaffold. And I remember one court case in Pennsylvania where a 68-year-old woman named Celia O'Donnell asked for and received an interpreter. O'Donnell is a classic Donegal name, and the nucleus of the American Molly Maguires came from the Irish-speaking portion of that county. From Margaret's book, however, I learned that it was one thing for an interpreter to render the witnesses' words into English for the benefit of the court, but it would have been quite another for the judicial process to render itself into Irish for the benefit of Celia O'Donnell. And that's just one of the powerful insights I took away from this book. The book also leaves us with a mystery, and it's one that Margaret addresses briefly, and that she acknowledges she cannot answer on the basis of the evidence available to her. Because even if some of the men convicted in the Maamtrasna Murders were innocent, and they were, somebody killed 5 people in the Joyce family home on August 17, 1882. And the killers blacked their faces and wore white vests. We will never know exactly who they were or why they did it. But in what kind of society was that violence common, and why? Thank you.
I'm not going to be anywhere near as erudite as this gentleman here. I'm only be able to tell you a little bit about Sean Sean, my father. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to say, mother, which is Irish for thank God and his Virgin Mother. And I'm thanking particularly today for a gentleman named Johnny Joyce, who, as you may know, spent a great deal of his life encouraging others to follow. His progeny is Stanton, right back there. She's the dark-haired one with her head down, Emily Joyce. Sean born my father's progeny are here too. Michael O'Toole, his sister Kathleen Ellis O'Toole, her son Danny, and Michael's son Patrick. In addition, my sister Mary Ann's daughter is here, Carolyn Mills Prendergast. Carolyn Cunaboy Mills Prendergast. Cunaboy is my father's name, which we did a little research. It means Kyon head smasher. So I'm not going to say much. Only that my father never spoke of this event. Never spoke of Maamtrasna, and rarely spoke about anything to do with Ireland. He clicked his heels and jumped up and down and said often, God bless America. We're the luckiest people alive to be in America, and that's what he'd be saying now. My mother, from the islands off the coast of Galway, in Ashar, cried all her life about Ireland. But my father was always licking his heels and celebrating. I don't know what else to tell you, except that if your name is Joyce, or you have any relatives named Joyce, there's one little boy who survived the violence, Patrick Joyce. We're still looking for him. So any Joyces you know, anywhere in the world, we're still anxious to find out what happened to Patrick. And Johnny Joyce, that little girl, Emily's grandfather, spent a lot of his time looking for him. My father was very grateful to be in America. He spoke Irish on every day of his life to my mother, who swore she didn't understand what he was saying. But when she rarely answered him in a phrase other than sha, maybe yes, right? But he used to go to a family named Fox in Jersey City to meet people who spoke Irish like he did, to keep up his Irish language. He loved the Irish language, but he would never tell us what he was talking to my mother about, who was on the floor laughing with whatever he said. That's about as much as I know about it. Margaret has done a wonderful job on the book. Every time I look at it, I see something new. I'm confirmed personally that I think it's the loss of Patrick that has made all the difference in the world. They wouldn't let him testify, but when he was interviewed right after the event, the police officer asked him, "Do you understand what an oath is?" He said yes. His brother, who survived the beating just 24 hours, said yes also. The failure to allow that little boy to testify that I did not know these people, and if it were Miles Joyce, he surely would have known his first cousin, who was within, not exactly eyeshot, but close by, who was a farmer like his own father with sheep, probably on the same grazing ground and the bog and everything else, and sharing Loch Mass as much as the British would allow them. We are delighted with the Irish people for giving Miles Joyce that wonderful pardon. However, we're still waiting for the country who actually tried and convicted him in a language he did not understand. We're waiting for them to apologize. That's it for me.
So my role here today is to say a bit about the legal context here, in particular as it impinges on the Irish language and the matter of interpreting. The reason I'm sort of connected to this is due to research that I had been doing about 10 to 12 years ago that resulted in trying to look at that legal provisions that were made for interpreting and the story essentially of how the courts evolved in the late 18th and 19th century. And of course, in the course of that research, naturally I came across this case. It had been written about by Jarlath Waldron and a number of earlier authors. I was pleased subsequently, after putting together this research and publishing it in the book that Kevin had mentioned, to see that it helped out maybe in some small way with Margaret's book. And so I'm going to say a little bit about what I found there, and then talk about how Margaret's book has added to the significance of this topic in general. So we want to understand there's sort of a lot of moving parts here. There's legal provisions for interpreters, and then there's also the expansions of the courts themselves, right? That's what puts these Irish speakers within the context of the legal system in the state to start with. It's not hard for us to see injustice in many of these cases, not just this one, but maybe the full range of legal cases that happened under the British system and the Irish system in the 18th and 19th century. Recall that this is a legal system that is in which class differences and ill treatment of particularly poor defendants, even poor prosecutors or people bringing case, is rife. It's a system in which penalties, including death, are used as a way to kind of impose control and to make participants in this legal system see the majesty and through sometimes leniency, support and accept this system, which in other ways is so unjust for them. And so part of the brilliance, I think, of Margaret's book is to look at this and say, yes, we would see injustice in this system. The fact of the matter is that contemporaries also saw this case as a miscarriage of justice. And that's the important key here, that even by the standards of the 19th century, by the standards of the provisions for interpreters, the provisions for how courtrooms should be run, there were errors here that were made, and that's what makes this case unique for us as contemporaries. So let me just, again, briefly talk about what the provisions are. Understand that up until the 18th century, there was no requirement that proceedings not be in Latin or legal French in these systems. So the Anglicization, shall we say, of the legal system is actually relatively recent, although certainly English was prevalent in the courtroom, at least at the higher echelons court system that existed at the time. Before 1737, when a statute passed in the second of George II, demanded that henceforth all court proceedings had to be conducted in English. And of course, they're thinking of an English-speaking population. That's perfectly normal in the context of England, but obviously in extending that to Ireland, that immediately becomes problematic because you have a large Irish-speaking population. In fact, in 1737, likely the majority, at least if we consider bilinguals. 1773, 1774, you see provisions made for interpreters for the first time, at least on the legal, expressively stated that you should pay for interpreters, in this case in the county assizes courts. These are the larger courts that work with more serious cases. They're more expensive to bring suit in, so we've always sort of been working under the assumption that there are not a ton of sort of lower class individuals able to bring suit. Nevertheless, you definitely see cases of Irish speakers in these assize courts, and they're using interpreters, and they're being paid under the terms of this statute by the grand juries. The grand juries are effectively the local government in Ireland in the 18th century and into the 19th century that carry the purse, right, that pay the money for these. 1837, and then again confirmed in a statute in 1851, you had to provide interpreters, and again, grand juries are authorized to pay money for them, somewhere between £5 and £15 a year generally, this time at petty sessions. These are quarter sessions. Again, the higher courts, not necessarily these local disputes, but higher level court cases. And then by the 1830s, you have a new form of court that is being introduced, which are the petty sessions cases. And these are often just land disputes or border issues, land conflicts between neighbors over land. And that's where you really get the issue of interpreters raised in the courtroom, because for the first time you have general population able to pay far less money to bring suit in these courts, and so you have them in the courtroom in a big way. So understand that this history of question of interpreters is tied up with the question of who has access to the courts in the first place, and that's a relatively recent development in Ireland, even mid-19th century. All right, the big turning point is 1858. There's a court case, it's on appeal, R.V. Burke, and in that case, what was largely discussed is the question of must you provide an interpreter if somebody is bilingual and understands English, right? And what circumstances that happens. And the takeaway on a 7-3 decision was that you should provide an interpreter if anybody wants it, right? If they feel more comfortable giving testimony in Irish, then you should provide that interpreter. And this is, again, why this case becomes so problematic, that they do not, in the case of Miles, uphold that. And there's the fact that they are generally seeing this as a provision for bilingual and not for monolingual, as in the case of Miles. But there are some subtleties to this case that I think are interesting. So it was a rape case originally, and the prosecution had won the conviction, and on appeal, the defendants were saying that the case should have been was incorrectly decided because it was heard that one of the prosecution witnesses knew enough English at least to sing a song in English. So therefore, this was an invalid conviction. And in the decision, there was not a lot of case law to go on for these judges who decided this on appeal. What they essentially were saying in many of the takeaways was, one is that too much court time was being dedicated to trying to ascertain the abilities of the witness and whether an interpreter was needed, right? And that was tying down the case, gumming up the works. And so my conclusion on this was that in reality, we see a lot of agency for Irish speakers here because they were forcing this issue. Right? They were showing up and saying, I will not give testimony in English. You have to provide me an interpreter regardless of my language ability. And so that was gumming up the works in the sense that they had to constantly assess the abilities of those Irish speakers to see if an interpreter was necessary. So post-1858, what they decided is that we're not going to work, we're not going to try to go back and forth on whether an interpreter is needed. We're simply going to extend that service if the language ability is such that the witness desires this. Now, this is a far, as Kevin had hinted, this is far from what we would consider an equitable modern system, right? Where not only is, we're providing interpreters simply based on the desire of the witness, and you see again and again in Margaret's book and in the evidence from the newspapers, a constant drumbeat about how really they're faking it, right? They're pretending that they want this to be done through an interpreter and through Irish simply because they want to buy time in the court to consider questions that are put to them. So not only is that the issue, but it's not an equitable in a modern sense that the proceedings of the court are being interpreted back to the witness, or in this case the accused, so that they understand, right? This is by no means a notion of facilitating understanding of state mechanisms in a language that they understand. All right, so that is the background, and that's sort of what I would leave it as today, just sort of understanding that context, and again, how much of a miscarriage this is in 1882, even by the standards of the time.
Thanks, folks. First, I want to thank the descendants and family of Miles Joyce for being with us today and participating in this tribute to Miles Joyce and to this honor of course, Margaret Kelleher's fine book. Her book has appropriated the Maamtrasna case, where the failure of the court to provide monoglot Irish speakers with interpreters and translators as a model to examine the complex social dynamics of language diversity, and the importance of providing new systems of interpretation and translators for native speakers whose language are considered subaltern languages. By the way, the #1 train downtown today has an ad for interpreters for Election Day. You can earn $2,300. Just want you to know that, folks. I don't know if they're offering it for Irish, but we'll see. Anyway, Margaret's book is important because it's about an aspect of the unequal nature of Anglo and Irish power relationships, in this case expressed about language itself. Let me offer a contemporary example of the unequal business of language. We have some people describe high prestige languages like English versus low prestige languages like Irish. And one of the things they say is high prestige languages are regarded as being able to deal with science and technology, and low prestige languages, of course, cannot. And in this respect, I'm very glad to point out that Donnelly Brennan's edition of Folklore Finther, a dictionary of finance, computer, and enterprise terms in English and Irish, is a valuable challenge to this myth of high prestige, low prestige. And I don't think we have anything like the Irish Costa Termia, which meets regularly to consider creating terminology in Irish language in various subject areas. Kelleher foregrounds the Maamtrasna against the major cultural shift in the change in the west of Ireland, and she endorses Bloombart's call for a revised sociolinguistics in a time of mass migration and globalization and the large-scale mobility in our global society. To advance her argument in Language, Life, and Death, she talks about the hope that social linguistics will generate a more dynamic model of linguistic change. And I'm pointing this out because we've been talking mainly, of course, today about the Irish location of the case, but really Kelleher's point is that this has much larger consequences on language and minority languages. In her discussion of language and the courts, she includes the examples, and of course she has a magisterial knowledge of 19th century history and literature, and she includes examples of the Irish speaker who often appears as a target of ridicule in 19th century Anglo-Irish literature. Episodes that illustrate the cultural imbalance, the hegemony of English over the cultural inferiority of the Irish. and she uses the cultural or the common strategies of evasion in Gerald Griffin's The Collegian, or the inapt translations in the courtroom of Somerville and Ross's An Irish Problem. I'd like to just mention another one which kind of flips this. An illustration of inequality informs a scene in Dion Boucicault's Napoga or the Wicklow Wedding. It's about 1798, but it's written in 1864 during the Fenian Rebellion. And in fact, Boucicault adjusted the language in The Wearing of the Green, and the British decided that they could not have this song sung in England at all, because it was, this was the Fenian Rebellion. Anyway, Sean the Post, played by Boucicault himself, appears in the Justice Hall, and the Major asks his name, and he kind of equivocates, you know who I am, that sort of thing. The Major writes his name down, and he says, Sean, that's the Irish for John, I suppose. And Sean shoots back, no sir, John is the English for Sean. So, he probably based it on a scene from Blanche of the Brandywine, but that's another story. As I say, Kelleher also includes some 450 allusions to language and humor in the pages of the National Collection of Irish Folklore. You were talking about your mother and killed with laughing.
Thanks to the research of Nicholas Wood from that.
Yes. So anyway, as I mentioned before, she has a magisterial knowledge of Irish history and literature through her discussion of the Maamtrasna trial and the importance of the case to sociolinguistics and politics. In the last words section of her book, she talks about the nationalist political writers who grabbed the Maamtrasna court case in their commentary. T.P. O'Connor's The Parnell Movement in 1886 criticized both agrarian violence and the flawed legal process in the Maamtrasna trial, the things that Nick referred to. And she also notes the nationalist invocations of Maamtrasna across the whole range of the Parnellite divide. And in the immediate aftermath of Maamtrasna to the present, Maamtrasna events have been incorporated into larger political narratives. Within the accounts of the Miles Joyce case, points to the breakdown or complicity or failure of the British state in dealing with Ireland. Now this was, as I say, 1882. But in 1895, there was another famous case. Remember, this is the time of the Home Rule movement, and the Irish are agitating for Home Rule. And there was a famous case called Bridget Cleary.
Oh.
Yeah, some of you know that, where a husband and his cohort murdered a wife, thought that the fairies had abducted her, and left a changeling in its place. Now, a lot of those stories would be told through the Irish language, I must say. Now, I'm saying, did the Bridget Cleary case in Tipperary in 1895 give the British a chance to revisit that controversial Irish trial? During the days of the Active Home Movement, they were saying, and if you read the papers at the time, the British papers at the time of the Bridget Cleary case, they said, these people, can they govern themselves? These fatuous people, they don't have a clue. Okay. Kelleher's methodology has involved a close reading of primary source documents with a way that the languages cross or collide, and I hope we have time for Margaret to give us an example of things that cross or collide. And she devotes special attention to traces of the Irish language in elements in text, and things like census records, folklore texts, newspapers, and so forth. And she also looked into news sources, and we could go through a whole list of those, but I won't bother you with that, and contemporary newspapers, and the recently digitized base. And I must say, it reminds me of Roy Foster talking about his biography of W.B. Yeats. And people said to him, you're writing a biography of W.B. Yeats? Everybody knows everything about Yeats. He says, yes, but there are other questions to ask. There are other things to find out. And so what Margaret has done is she's looked at these news sources, and the lesson here for us is to keep digging there are new questions, and especially in our digitized world that Nick and Margaret know so much about. So these previous unexamined sources provide petitions and memorials filed on behalf of the Maamtrasna prisoners. And again, Kelleher has looked at the complex acts of translation and formulaic language in the petitions, and they demonstrate the way that the monoglot Irish speakers were very isolated in these kinds of proceedings. Another strength of her study is the relationship between law and language, which of course Nick has talked to us about before. And we've all also heard about the Patsy Joyce case, which suggests, of course, as Kevin has pointed out, that these figures who came in, that Patsy observed in their awnings, in their blackened faces, that was characteristic of the agrarian violence of the time in that part of the world. I might add this, some of you know the book by Jarlath Waldron, Maamtrasna, The Murder and Mystery. And Kelleher knows that, of course, and is conversant with it, and with Sean O'Curran's Ehor, and they both had, now Father Waldron's interest in Maamtrasna, he was interested in the crime. Who did it? Who were the probable murderers? What were their motives? That was what he was concerned about. He was a priest in the local area. And she identifies with the O'Curran book. She's more interested in the methodology, and in his conclusion that a legal injustice was done to the defendants by denying them their legal right to counsel to those who spoke and understood their language. And again, this suggests the wider implications of this book. It's not just about Ireland in the 19th century. It has a lesson for us, for all speakers of what we might call minority or the lesser used languages. An aside of this, Ehor was launched at the Green Street Courthouse, the same courthouse where Maamtrasna defendants were tried. And of course, for the Joyceans in the room, that courthouse is not far from Barney Kiernan's pub, where the action in the Cyclops chapter of Ulysses takes place. In short, Margaret Kelleher's book uses the gruesome details of the Maamtrasna murder as a vivid case study in the complexity of the language shift from Irish to English in the post-famine west of Ireland. Thank you.
You may wonder what a Jewish kid from Brooklyn is doing here today. I mean, I have an Irish American wife who's in the audience here, who holds 2 passports, and an Irish speaking son who is off somewhere overseas studying Irish and British history to understand it better. But that's not why I was invited. I was invited because Margaret sent me this book, or publishers did, and I love this book, and it resonated for me for 2 reasons. And we just heard this is not just a book about 19th century Ireland, and I think everyone can learn lessons from this book or feel something that is at the heart of it. And I'll speak both from my own personal experience, tangentially, and then turn to my world, which is the world of a Shakespearean, to focus on one moment in this trial that I think Shakespeare would have loved, and Margaret does such an extraordinary job of retelling. About 20 years ago, you read a lovely list of books that I'd written. I leave out of that list one book. I wrote about Bavaria. I wrote about a small town in Bavaria, and a small town that was filled with Nazis. And after I published that book, I got a knock on my door in my Upper West Side apartment of a federal marshal who was delivering papers to sue me in a Bavarian court for defaming a convicted dead Nazi. And I thought it was funny. Do not joke around with a federal marshal when you think the papers are bizarre and strange. And I had to experience, my German is negligible, and that's probably putting a good spin on it. So I had to go through a court experience, first in a small town in Bavaria and then in the Munich High Court, in which I was the outlier. I was the one unfamiliar with the language of the court and the customs of the court and the cultural differences. As an American, I believe in a First Amendment where you cannot sue a writer or journalist for merely recounting what he or she has said. But that's not the case in Germany. So one of the things that resonated for me in this book was the difference between, if you will, the Imperial English at this moment and the Irish. And I really felt on the Irish team while reading this book. And the case came down to a conversation that I had held with an old woman in the village whose English was pretty good, so I didn't use an interpreter and record that conversation. And she told me frankly about some of the crimes that had been committed by this man I was writing about in this village shortly after Kristallnacht in Bavaria. And at the trial, she claimed that her English was not very good and that I had misunderstood her. And I could have had my legal representative, who was happily bilingual, pin her down on this. But if she had lost, she would have been a pariah in the village, and all I was going to suffer was not a hangman's rope, but the remainder of my unsold copies in German of my book put on the fire, I suppose. That's one way in which this story resonates for me. We're all going to find ourselves in the position of the Irish at one point or another when we're in a court and language is at stake. But I want to talk a little bit, for those of you who haven't yet read this book, this will be a tease or a taster of why you need to read it. And it has to do with Patrick Joyce, Patsy Joyce, who is this extraordinary boy who is brought into this stifling court in Dublin. And it must have been terrifying for a boy at 8 or 9 years old, an Irish speaker, not an English speaker, to be put on the stand and then to be asked the following questions. And mind you, he had already at this point, at the murder scene when he was giving testimony, explained and given evidence that members of the party, the murder party, were disguised and had blackened or had soot on their faces, as he had put it. And the prosecution, the English prosecution, knew this and had to figure out a way not to let this enter the record. And this is the moment that I think Shakespeare, whose plays are filled with trials, because they're also explorations of injustice, as this book is. This is the moment he would have retold had he been alive to witness. So the prosecution asks the young man, instead of what did you see, what do you recall of these events? I asked him instead the following catechism. Have you gone to chapel? And do you know your catechism? And the little boy heard this from the translator, and the translator repeated it to the court. I do not know. The next question was, have you said your prayers? The translator asked the young man this question in Irish. He replied in Irish, and the translator told the court he had said, I have not said them. The next question came from the Attorney General. Do you know what it is to tell a lie? And at this point, the young man is the one who is being accused. And he replied through his translator, I do. And they asked him next, do you know what will happen if you tell a lie? And at this confusing moment at this court, the young man clearly did not know what was going to happen, whatever he said. And he replied, I do not. At which point the prosecution said, there's no use asking him any other questions, and dismissed him from the stand. And when the Attorney General later, and I'm drawing on Margaret's extraordinary account, gave the reasons for this testimony. He said, this little child will not be produced because it is not the duty of the crown to harrow the feelings of anyone in court. It was necessary to produce him once. It was found that he was so young he had not learned his prayers, nor had been taught any little hymn, and consequently did not know the nature of an oath. It's this moment of self-protection and defensiveness in the haughty language of that Attorney General that brings me to what I was teaching yesterday to my Columbia students, some lines from King Lear, which is another one of those plays filled with trial. And it speaks directly to the injustice at the heart of this story and to the Englishmen who were persecuting and prosecuting this case. Robes and furred gowns hide all, plate sin with gold, and the strong lance of justice hurtless breaks, armed in rags, a pygmy's straw does pierce it. And what I love about Margaret's book is it pierces through the injustice. So I'm very grateful for it, and I would urge you all to read it. Thank you.
In the Morgan Library, there's a letter from Oscar Wilde, written quite late in his career, to English publishers who are about to publish his plays. And he said something quite interesting for anyone who's interested in register or Ireland and England or language. He says, could you just go through the text for me, checking the shalls and wills? Because English usage, I'm Irish, so I don't know how to use shall and will. And to this day, anyone Irish dealing with English people who use shall and will differently, I have absolutely no idea how to use them. I wish I did. And here is Oscar Wilde, who refers to himself in De Profundis as a lord of language. Here he is at the height of his power as a playwright in London, using an English tone in his plays, with one crucial thing that he doesn't know. His father was a commissioner. He was knighted, Sir William Wilde, for his work on the Irish census. He was commissioner for censuses for 1851, 61, and 71. And in writing about the 1841 census, the returns which he analysed, he noted just how difficult it was to get epidemiological evidence. That because the words for the diseases were so spread out, were in two languages, and were in the dialects of two languages, simply it was very difficult to get the statistics right. This became his great value to the British as they attempted to modernise, civilise, or systematise Ireland, that he had his foot in two camps. In other words, he was a doctor, he spoke English, and he claimed to know what words the people used. For example, he said for scrofula, these words were used in Ireland: the evil, king's evil, the running sore, balloon, bone evil, glandular disease, and impostulence, deficiency in the neck, the wasting ulcer, cut in the neck, and in Irish, asplog, brogach, violon, kinay, knock, quit, brogach. And that he produced these words to the English, making clear, that this is the problem we have in Ireland, because there's so many words for these things, and I am the one who can bring you into both. Margaret Kelleher's book is very useful in this way, because it gives us some notion of just how porous the idea, or how difficult it is to be clear at the idea of what bilingualism meant, what use exactly William Wilde was to those who were putting the censuses together. And she talks about various people who claimed to be bilingual, and she's talking about Peter O'Brien, who became the Lord Chief Justice, and so he was in a case which depended on the exact meaning of a word in the Irish language. The services of a professor of Irish who had written several books, this is quoted from the book, who had written several books in the Irish language were enlisted. So this is from Peter O'Brien's memoir, the thing. Yet he did not speak or understand what the Irish peasants so aptly called cradle Irish. That is to say, he had not heard it spoken from the cradle, but had acquired it later in life. And the professor, according to himself, was a very efficient Irish scholar. And he said, my father, who was a boy, picked up Little Irish from the peasant in Clare, said, now professor, can you tell me how to say the simple sentence in Irish, have you seen a hare pass by here? And the expert admitted defeat. Well, continued the Chief Justice, can you say, are the hounds in sight? The professor had again to acknowledge himself defeated. And yet, said the interrogator, you call yourself an Irish scholar. I fear your Irish is not of any practical use, etc. And so too with Sir William Wilde, that Margaret asked the question. I mean, it seems a basic question, but no one's asked it before. Did he speak Irish? And she says it's tantalisingly difficult to answer, that he was that he had accompanied his father in various places in Roscommon, and he did claim, as you can see from this list, to know Irish. The idea of knowing Irish and speaking Irish seems to be there seems to be a subtle difference between the two, and Angela Burke points out that his ways of looking at the words used for disease reflects his understanding of Irish fairy narratives in both languages, and that they were sometimes tragically implemented. And then Peter Froggatt says that in 1965 that Wilde had fluency in Irish, and then Transcript White, whose biographer, relays a lengthy account, who declared that he was unable to understand, this is Oscar Wilde's father, any of the Irish language conversation which took place between a teenager and an elderly local man. So this idea that somehow he was both fluent in Irish and not, all at the same time, when it was useful with certain words he could do it, and when it wasn't, he wasn't. And I think this is something we have to look at in any search for what language people spoke, how bilingual people were. That if you look at, for example, the census forms, and in Ireland they become this extraordinary vehicle for scholarship, that you can see people's writing down when they were asked in 1901 and 1911 what languages are spoken, and you're entitled to write Irish and English. In my case, in the 1911 census, my grandfather says that he was fluent in Irish and English, and that his son Tom, my uncle Tom, age 11 was fluent, and my uncle Pat, age 7 was fluent. I never heard a word of Irish spoken in that house. My uncle Pat later became fluent. My uncle Tom certainly did not. I don't think my grandfather had any Irish at all, but this was a political thing. This was 5 years before the 1916 rebellion, in which my grandfather took part. One of the stories they told was that when my grandfather was interned after the rebellion in Wales, the Enniscorthy men were talking English. The Welsh guards were talking Welsh. And they were all meant to be involved in this struggle within the empire for Irish freedom with Welsh guards. And so the ironies gather in this matter. The ironies gather further when we come to the case of James Joyce, which Margaret mentions in her book. How do we read their 1901 census, when the father says that James Joyce and his brother Stanislaus spoke Irish and English? And it seems to me here we're looking not at nationalism as much as pride over the boys' scholarship, that they were good scholars, these boys, and anything that you could put down, you would put down about their value or the ways in which they had been scholars. And then we come to the essay that James Joyce wrote on the Maamtrasna Murders in the Triestine newspaper, Il Piccolo della Sera, which appeared in 1907. And just how difficult it is to read this piece, to interpret it. He writes about what happened. It's an essay called Ireland at the Bar, or Ireland in the Dock, it could equally be translated as. And he gives an account of what happened. And he says that the figures of this bewildered old man, and he's treating Miles Joyce as though he were an old man, says, left over from a culture which is not ours. And for a moment you see Joyce in some other light, as Gabriel Conroy, as an East Coast boy, as a Dubliner, as someone who has gone all cosmopolitan on us. A culture which is not ours. But then he slowly moves in this sort of wavering essay from talking as though he were cosmopolitan to actually talking about Ireland and England in a way which is very close to the Citizen in Ulysses. He refers to the relationship between the two islands as 6 centuries of armed occupation and over 100 years of legislation. And he too, in another essay, he talks about the possibility of an Ireland of the future which will be actually bilingual. which was a lecture called Ireland, Island of Saints and Sages. So the idea for him, of course, he's in Trieste in 1907, where language is a hugely contested matter, where the locals speak Triestino, and of course it's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so German is the official language. Italian is the second language. And as Margaret Kelleher points out in her book, this business of the census, how we read Joyce's census form, saying that his children spoke Italian, which the officials thought was really unlikely since the parents spoke English. But actually this is in fact what happened. The Joyce family ended up moving from English into Triestino as the language that the parents and the two children actually spoke. So that I think what we draw from this book is how uneasy and difficult it is, how uneasy the question of bilingualism is, how hard it is to define, and how much that business of the official language, the unofficial language, the space in between the two, actually causes so much grief and so much difficulty, and in certain other instances so much comedy between any interaction between the two islands, or even between two parts of the island. So I want to end on two contemporary things. The business of bilingualism operates very largely in something like the Irish Constitution, where there are two versions of the Constitution. One is in Irish and one is in English. It is agreed that the Irish version will always have precedence over the English version if there should be a difficulty of interpretation. And when we look at the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which was the anti-abortion amendment, the Irish word for the unborn in that amendment is a much stronger word than the English word. And when it was slipped in, almost no one noticed that it's namyo gan bre. In other words, it's as opposed to unborn, it's the alive without birth was the word used for unborn in that translation, or indeed original version of the amendment. And there's this one way in which bilingualism suddenly slips, where the words are not equal. And I suppose the second one, when I read this book, I think of 1984 and the Kerry Babies trial, the Kerry Babies Tribunal, in which a great number of Dublin barristers went to Kerry, and they questioned deeply this family about all their habits and their sexual mores. And it was in the end a question of language. It was a question of tone. It was a question of vowel sounds almost, that the barristers control the language. And the people under investigation simply, in the end, did not share a language with the Dublin people. And that business, in a way, in any trial in which involves people who are in any way marginalized, seen as marginalized, or poor, or deprived, or from some area that does not produce its own barristers, its own judges, that will always be unequal and will always manage to marginalize further the group who are under investigation. Thank you very much.
I want to begin by expressing my own thanks to Glucksman House for facilitating what is genuinely, for me, a unique occasion. I can't tell you how powerful it is to see the book in the world in this way, and to see the implications of the book unfolded so ably by this panel. It means a huge deal to me. And it particularly means a huge deal to be reminded of the human story at the centre of this, and particularly pleased that Carolyn and her family members are here. I do want to echo, at the risk of upsetting you, Emily, her voice, her words of tribute to your grandfather, Johnny Joyce. There's a lovely phrase in Irish, Dina inaha ar chlín a fiorna, gone the way of the truth. And Johnny dedicated himself exceptionally to securing the exoneration of Miles Joyce. And Carolyn and I have talked about this, the very powerful language crossing indeed, and family crossings, whereby Johnny Joyce, great-grandson of the murdered John Joyce, his own grandfather Martin Joyce, was out of the house that night. If Martin had been there that night, Johnny would not exist. And the way in which Johnny instead dedicated himself to the search for truth for exoneration for Miles Joyce. And I do want to echo our tribute to the late Johnny Joyce in that way. Also for me, it is a family story. I talk about this in the beginning of the book. The way in which I discovered in my own case, my family, lots of census findings, including the fact that in the case of the Kelleher family, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were bilingual as late as 1911 in North Cork and Dromahane. I didn't know that until I began the search for this book. And yet my grandfather, my future grandfather, Michael Kelleher, he and his siblings were listed as English-speaking only. And then down the road, the family of my future grandmother, the Ahern's, my great-grandparents on that side spoke English only, but my grandmother was listed as a scholar speaking Irish and English. So I did have great fun in the book putting the Kelleher census form next to the Joyce one. That felt particularly sweet. I just want to mention, I suppose, a couple of things for me along the way, and particularly aware of students in the room. And maybe also a sort of, what would you say, endorsement of my own discipline. Because I think one of the best skills I had was hopefully anyway, the skill of close reading. You know, in many ways, I was looking at questions that can't be answered. You know, for example, the reason for the murders, and no doubt we'll discuss that in the panel discussion. But I was also trying to recover voices and experiences of people mediated by time, but also mediated by language. And in many ways, one of the things I'm most pleased about in the book is the number of times people have said to me that they're going back to sources and looking at them differently. So in many ways, I was trying to read between the lines and recover some lines along the way. And I just want to mention two original sources that would give you a sense of what I mean. And that is, I suppose, the moment early on in the trial of Miles Joyce. Again, I want to express my great debt to the work, the scholarship of Nicholas Wolfe. I literally would not have done this book without Nicholas' book as a predecessor. And in many ways, the confidence and encouragement that his research gave me to kind of look again at the issue of Irish and the public sphere. So I spent a lot of time looking at the court transcript. The court transcript survives for the case. It's 250 pages. It was typed. What a boon for the researcher. And I think I got the archivist on a particularly good moment who allowed me to photocopy it. So I spent much time looking over that, and then I began to compare it with the other accounts at the time. And this is what I mean by the power of close reading. Because the following passage does not appear in the court transcript, but it does appear in the account given of the trial by the Freeman's Journal the following Monday. And the case was such a, I suppose, cause célèbre as to receive page coverage in the Freeman's Journal, the Conservative paper, the Daily Express, and indeed the Belfast newsletter. So I found this moment in the Freeman's Journal, and this is at the beginning of the trial of Miles Joyce. At the sitting of the court, the Attorney General asked the learned counsel for the defence if the prisoner understood English. Mr. Concannon replied that he thought he did not. Compose of that for a moment. The defence counsel wasn't sure as to whether or not his own client could understand English, and that it might be better to have the evidence of the witnesses who speak English interpreted to the prisoner in Irish. The interpreter asked the prisoner in Irish if he understood the evidence that was being given in English, and informed the court that the prisoner replied in the affirmative. In a way, it's a sort of inverse of that very powerful moment that Jim singled out earlier. You can see what has happened. The interpreter asked Miles Joyce in Irish, "Do you understand me?" Miles Joyce said, "Yes, I understand you." The interpreter translated this as "yes," and the judge took that to mean that Miles Joyce understood English. And the services of the interpreter that were available in the courtroom were suspended from him for the remainder of the trial. And they were returned only a day later at the giving of the verdict. the jury retired for 6 minutes to deliver a verdict of guilty. And when they returned, it became clear, and again this is recorded in fact both in the court transcript and in the newspapers at the time, it became clear that Miles Joyce could not understand the verdict, and that the judge then decided to return the services of the interpreter, Constable Evans, to him. And you know, even all these decades, over a century later, this again is the account from the Freeman's Journal, and I just want to read a couple of lines from it, again keeping in mind it's so mediated by language, it's also mediated by pronoun. The interpreter, when he translated Miles Joyce's protest of innocence, turned it into the third person. Absolutely unsafe practice, you know, by any standards of the time. And this is the account in the newspaper. And I suppose I just want to read it again to give you a sense of that, even though this is so heavily mediated, I think those of you who know Irish in the audience will hear even the cadences of the original Irish of Miles Joyce's words, which are of course lost to us. The interpreter, Constable Evans, was called by direction of the learned judge, and he communicated to the prisoner in Irish the fact that he had been found guilty. A change then came upon the prisoner. He showed a little fear and clutched the bar of the dock, but looking upwards with a fervent expression and attitude of invocation spoke in Irish. The interpreter rendered it as follows: he leaves it to God and the Virgin above his head. He had no dealing with it, no more than the person who was never born, nor had he against anyone else. For the last 20 years he had done no harm, and if he had, might he never go to heaven. He was as clear of this as the child yet to be born. He slept in his bed with his wife that night, and he had no knowledge about it whatever. He is quite content with whatever the gentleman may do to him, but whether he is to be hung or crucified, he is as free as he can be. And the Conservative paper, the Daily Express, rendered a version of this and then concluded saying, his testimony, quote, made a remarkable impression on the court. And there is that sense, and I think it's one of the things that really spurred me on during some of the darker days of research. There was a sense, as recorded in the newspapers of the time, that something wrong had happened. That phrase is not used elsewhere in the case, and that his testimony made a remarkable impression on the court. I'm so pleased, you know, that the comments of the panellists, you know, have brought out the implications of the case for how we think about bilingualism, and indeed how we think about language use today, and the standard of interpreters in our own courts in Ireland or in the United States. But I thought I'd like to finish with something I actually haven't read myself out loud before, and it's as close as we can get to the voice of Bridget Joyce, Carlin's great-grandmother, and it's a high, again, heavily mediated source, but again, I just want to kind of bring it to mind, and again, maybe we can all read between the lines, or indeed listen between the lines. On December the 11th, 1882, Miles Joyce had been convicted in November, and he would be executed in Galway on December the 15th. So 4 days before her husband's execution, a letter was sent on Bridget Joyce's behalf from, it was translated as Derry High, or Shanvala Cahill, the kind of townland Dara of the area. And this letter was sent to the Freeman's Journal. We don't know how it was sent. My guess would be that probably the local parish priest wrote this on her behalf. It's very heavily mediated by language and by the kind of rhetorical standards of the time, and yet I think it still tells its own story. And I'm just going to finish by reading from this. I have a photocopy which I'll give Carlin when I finish, and it's actually from the National Archives. It's a photocopy of the letter that was received by the Freeman's Journal. So this is the letter is actually in the Freeman's Journal, which was I say was written on her behalf, but which she was, and it's really important to give her agency in this, which she was part of sending. And the editor of the Freeman's Journal very admirably sent it immediately to Dublin Castle as the wife's petition, and written in red at the end, "This must be treated as a memorial to be sent to the judge in the usual way." So in a way it entered, you could say, kind of diplomatic silence, but it was printed in the Freeman's Journal the next day, but it still didn't have an effect. And again, I think it's worth mentioning by way of context, many of the accounts of the time suggest that the governor of Galway jail was waiting for the telegram to commute Miles Joyce's death sentence to a prison sentence. And infamously, the Lord Lieutenant at the time, Earl Spencer, sent a telegram just the morning of that day saying the law must take its course. And this was one of the very many powerful things about the pardon, or I prefer the word mahunas, which literally means remittance, to make good, was that President Higgins gave this from Áras an Uachtaráin, which of course was the Viceregal Lodge. That is the building from which the infamous telegram was sent in December 1882 saying the law would take its course. But I'll finish with as close as we can get to the voice and feelings and maybe we can get closer to the feelings indeed of Bridget Joyce, and I'll just read an extract. "Sir, I beg to state through the columns of your influential journal that my husband Miles Joyce, now a convict in Galway jail, is not guilty of the crime. I publicly confess before high heaven that he never committed that crime nor left his house on that night, and Bridget, by the standards of the time, would not have been allowed to testify on her husband's behalf." Going back to the letter, "The 5 prisoners that pleaded guilty will declare he is innocent. They will swear now and at this dying moment that he never was implicated in that fearful murder." And she concludes, "I beg and implore of His Excellency, the Lord Lieutenant, to examine and consider this hard case of an innocent man, which leaves a widow and 5 orphans to be 4 long adrift on the world. I crave for mercy. I am, sir, yours truly, the wife of Miles Joyce, that is to be executed on the 15th instance. Thank you."
Okay, so if it's okay with the panelists, I think what we should do is open it up to the audience. We're going to have several mics here at the table, and we'll pass the mic through each room so everybody can hear. Just one thing, I was conscious in listening to all the panelists, starting even with my own introduction. I gave an evaluation of the book. I deliberately didn't say what the book was about. I think we've sustained that literary device throughout the hour, so the tension has been rising as to what actually happened on August 17th, 1882. The answer is, beyond a certain point, we don't know. And Margaret touched on the miscarriage of justice that follows, but the floor is open.
Can I ask a question of Margaret?
Yes, so there,
I did from your, and I got a big loud voice.
It's a big room, so there we go, and it gives me an excuse.
I like to hear that part of your book. I read a statement that the Irish speak in idioms. Now, my father had a little name for everybody all over the neighborhood, in Irish and sometimes in English. And he was quite a comedian. He liked to laugh. Do you think it would be appropriate to say idiom might also have the meaning of making you laugh? They speak in a manner that you might laugh. They speak in a manner that you're not going to be able to translate into English, except by corrupting things. When I saw that they speak in idioms, I said, if that isn't my old man, I don't know who is.
I'm going to give a suitably kind of indirect answer and just say that what I actually learned myself in the last hour or so is how close actually the tragedy and the comedy can be. I was thinking of that on a number of occasions that came out, particularly it became clear to me from what Colin said, and Nick brings that out in his research all the time, that often incomprehension is a joke, that there are so, Nick traces courtroom jokes and kind of courtroom humour. And what I was reading was so grim, and yet many of the accounts in literature at the time are actually are comic, and I think I hadn't actually realised myself until this panel just how close that can be. That what turns into humour and very dark humour, it's a very fine line. But I think again the point about the Kerry Babies Tribunal and about idiom. There's a famous case, for example, that Roland Barthes writes about in the 1940s, the Dominici case, where the issue there was different dialects of French, really. So I do think that there's really important research at the moment, for example, about African American English in US courts, and again failures of people to be properly understood in the so-called standard language of the court. So I think you're right, Carolyn, but I'd say in many ways idiom is almost more urgent today than it was historically.
Forgive my lack of knowledge on this, but just in terms of the non-understanding from Dublin of the people in the West, and two questions. Was the area where this family lived unique in its lack of English or their use of Irish at that point in time, which seems to be getting a little late? And my other question was, in terms, and going much further back, in terms of daily usage, when did Dublin have it? Did Dublin have it? And the progression of the loss of the language that was to us.
I might answer the first one and then invite maybe Nick and Maureen to come in about just some of the complexities of language. One figure that reverberates for me still, all the years of working on the book, is that according to the 1881 census, which is limited in its findings because the individual census forms don't survive, but I think one can still find out a lot of what's happening at a barony level. And in the area where Miles Joyce lived in 1881, in the barony of Ross, there were entries for just over 8,000 people, and over 7,000 of those spoke Irish. And of those, about half again were listed as being bilingual. And I often say to my own students that my own journey in the case is I used to say Miles Joyce spoke only Irish. I now say he spoke Irish only. You hear the difference. I'm still always tempted to talk about people speaking only English, but forgive me. But if we look at that statistic, and it's in many ways it's quite a dry one, but the human story behind it is that Miles Joyce lived in an area where 90% of the people in his milieu spoke and understood Irish. 90%. But what I discovered when I did further research, particularly on the fate of the men who were imprisoned, who in many ways I think have been lost from the story, and included Miles Joyce's two brothers and Miles Joyce's nephew, who were all innocent as well. There are harrowing accounts, for example, of when they were admitted into Kilmainham jail in September, getting ready for the trial in November. And one of the prison wardens describes them as having, and it's particularly resonant today, of their describing how many children they had by holding up their fingers. But what that also suggests is that the prison warden didn't understand Irish. And then I discovered that a number of the men spent time in Maryborough, now Portlaoise Jail, in the 1880s and 1890s. And at that time, there was one warden in the jail who understood Irish. So I suppose one of the things that brought home to me, in a way I hadn't expected, is a sort of, it's almost like crossing the Shannon, as we'd say in Ireland, just a huge cultural divide between a situation where Miles Joyce in 1881 lived in an area where 90% of the people understood Irish, to a situation east of the country where one prison warden in the jail understood Irish. So, and for me, it leads us to think really differently about 19th century Ireland as really a sort of a schism, really, in the country when it comes to comprehension of Irish. So, but maybe invite Maureen and Nicholas if they want to come in.
I might just add, there's a really subtle but very interesting thing that you say in that passage there about Ross, which is that there's every incentive in that time period and in that census in the 19th century to not claim monolingualism, right? Or claiming bilingual. So not only are they returned as that, they're every incentive not to. So there's a cultural thing going on there, and it's very clear. In terms of Dublin, there's a situation where what we know about the cities and about the towns in Ireland is that there's a constant migration to them in the 19th century that potentially places Irish on the street, even if, like, Dublin is not necessarily predominantly Irish-speaking city at any point in history here, at least certainly by the 18th century. Although there is a scribal history there, a group of scribes that moved into the city from the Midlands that are notable in history. So they are present, and sometimes they're invisible on the record. They are there, and we are aware of them. So.
Just to mention that when we're dealing with 1882, which is the Miles Joyce trial, after the famine, of course, we have the real loss to the country is the west of Ireland. People go to America, the number of Irish speakers goes down tremendously, but it continues to go down because English is the language of opportunity and the language for immigrants, and so you see that happening a lot. As far as Dublin is concerned, I want to go to 1960 for just a minute, say two things, two writers. One was the wonderful, irrepressible Flann O'Brien, aka Miles Nagopoulos, who had a regular column in the Irish Times, and a lot of people told me in those years that it sent them back to their Irish so that they could be up and read what Miles was saying. The other thing I want to mention is that Martin O'Coin, probably the best writer in the Irish language of his time in fiction, only wrote one thing in English, and it was a pamphlet called Mr. Hill and Mr. Tara. When he suggested that Irish-speaking area of Connemara be turned into a wolf sanctuary, and that Irish speakers go into Dublin, where they could have a lot more influence by being in the Dublin area and elected and being part of the government, it would be much more important for the language. And to some degree, that's happened. I was talking a little bit earlier about the Irish language and education, and the two hot secondary schools, I think I'm right, Margaret, are still Colossia Isagon, Colossia Owen, with their good Irish, and the same thing with Pierce's school, Scalenda, that their people went on very well with their Irish, and they knew all their subjects, but they went on very well with their Irish as well. So that Irish has really come back to Dublin because of these high prestige schools, which are high prestige because they get their kids into good third level programs.
Question there?
Oh, sorry.
You mentioned that the interpreter in the trial was a Constable Evans. Doesn't sound like he was an Irish speaker from Cradle, probably. I don't know, but I'm guessing. What do we know about the interpreters? Like, who were they? What was their, if they were local people, like, what would that do to their social standing?
It's a very pertinent question, and in ways there are two answers. The belief Jar Waldron had, which I think was very much a local story, is that Evans was from Donegal, and part of the power of that version was that not alone was he, alienated by being a member of the constabulary, but also that he would have spoken a dialect that arguably the men, couldn't understand or certainly weren't comfortable with. In many ways, that's the better story. The truth, I think, from our archival research I did in the RIC records, is that Evans was actually from the area. He was from Spiddle, but interestingly, he was a member of the Evangelical Church. and I think had learned Irish in that context, had married in an evangelical church in Spiddal, and had been used as an interpreter in the Petty Sessions Courts locally before that, and then had been brought to Dublin to appear for an earlier trial and was kind of kept on. But certainly the level of alienation, by there being a constable, I think is considerable. On the other hand, they're kind of more heroic stories. James mentioned so powerfully the case of Patsy and Carlin as well. Patsy and his dying brother made depositions at the scene of the crime in Irish that were translated and recorded by a young constable who had Irish, as we'd say. I suppose it's an important point again that there were members of the constabulary who were doing their job, and those records were actually kept impeccably, the dying depositions and information. The problem was how they were actually used later by the prosecution, and the local constabulary did their job. They took meticulous records, but as I say, the evidence was really suppressed later. And when my colleague Niamh Howlin in UCD was called upon to do an inquiry into the case for the pardon, and all of those issues played a big factor, because a key element, I suppose, that we didn't mention earlier is that for the pardon or a remittance to be made, it had to be found that the case was unsafe according to the standards of the time. So Niamh Howlin's research, which is actually available online, she did a meticulous account of that, and all of this, the treatment of Patsy and the composition of the jury, played a key part. So there are heroic examples, I think, of local constabulary who were doing their job, doing their jobs very honourably. Yeah.
The guy's name, I think, was Kelly.
Kelly, that's right, yes.
But he wasn't allowed to go and translate in Dublin.
In Dublin,
That was a
that's
big
right.
problem.
Following 1802, were there not, or the year of the French before that, were there not formal legal prohibitions against the teaching of, or in some way conversing in Irish, in Gaelic, or is that not the case?
In what year, sorry?
Well, 1802 is an example, but the prohibitions, were there not legal prohibitions against teaching?
Yes, I suppose it depends on the period and the part of the country, but I think Maureen's point is a really key one about, in many ways, the economic incentive, I think, is arguably a really powerful one. I'm always reminded of Joe Lee, late of this parish, his great comment where he said, we have many explanations that account for the acquisition of English, the power of the church, the power of the education system, you're right, that forbade it in government-sponsored schools. But he said those factors don't actually explain the whole-scale loss of Irish. And I think that's a fair point, that in many ways the might have been in Irish culture would have been bilingualism. Other cultures and societies achieved that. And so I think there are almost two questions here. The acquisition of English, the sort of, I suppose, pull factor, but the kind of, almost the association of the language being cursed in a way, or being a liability, I think would be, would you agree on that one?
Yeah, if you compare it, for example, to Catalonia, which remained bilingual, that there was never a stigma attached to speaking Catalan, that often the richest person, the industrialist, spoke Catalan, and the workers coming in from southern Spain spoke Spanish. Their efforts were to assimilate, and so that their children might talk Catalan, so their children, the only way you could actually have certain power in Catalonia, oddly enough, was to speak Catalan. I mean, I've actually seen it, you must have seen it too, where in Donegal, the parents were completely bilingual, and the children spoke only English. And that, it struck me, was a decision of the mothers, that she didn't want the children laughed at when they went into the bigger town, that they somehow had a funny twist in their voice or something funny. I saw in Galway once where with two friends with good graduates of UCG, middle class fellows, just a single laugh at a fellow who'd come in from the island at the way he walked or something about him. And it was always that idea that if you even had a hint that Irish came to you naturally, then it was it was a stigma. But there's another way of looking at this, which is, if you look at Tom Murphy's play, Whistle in the Dark, Dado, that's the word of Irish, boasts that all himself in the evening at the golf club, himself and the doctor and the solicitor, talk nothing but Irish, as though it's sort of an example of the fact that they're educated, that they went right through school, as opposed to leaving at 14. And so it's a funny mixture of things, but that stigma of not wanting to be bilingual actually comes, I think, very, very deeply within the culture over, it was associated not just with poverty, but with some sort of backwardness. And people didn't want it anymore. And they stopped it simply by never speaking Irish in the house.
Could I mention just two quick points? In 1831, the British government introduced the National Education Act, and set up a series of national schools in Ireland, and the language of instruction was English. That's point number one. Number two is, remember that post-famine immigration is the immigration of siblings. Young people went out and they joined older brothers and sisters and aunts, and I see heads going up and down, your grandmothers and your aunts and so forth. And so they would need English. English would be the language of opportunity. We know this here in the city of New York. People moved up through the labor movement because they could represent the position of the workers to management. And women worked in domestic service as English speakers, and when they went to South America, places like Argentina, they taught English. They were brought into households because they spoke English. So there was a value to English. When I was a student and went to Coshadaga to learn some Irish, a local man was very annoyed with me. Every time I met him on the road, he would frown at me and he'd push the kids back, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And the woman of the house told me finally it was because I had come, an English speaker from New York, had come to come to Coshadaga to seriously learn Irish. And he had spoken to his children, and in those days, it was before the change in the Immigration Act, and they were all going to emigrate to Boston. They were all going to Norway. And here I was, a bad example of how to behave if you're going to go to America. And so Mike Namusany Moore, we called him, we lived in an old bus. He said, he just didn't like me as a result.
Question here.
Margaret, I have a question about the miscarriage of justice issue, and the case of Bridget Cleary was cited, and rightly so, and how it was politicized, and indeed cited in the House of Commons in relation to Home Rule and politicized. So that motivation was very strong. But I'm personally just unclear, if it was accepted that this was a serious miscarriage of justice, a la the practices at the time, what was the motivation for that?
Motivation as in, so whether or not it became a kind of a case at the time, is that the question? Or in the immediate aftermath, there was quite a lot of kind of nationalist agitation about it. And remember, Miles Joyce was a taunt used sometimes against the Lord Lieutenant, for example. But it seemed his fate seemed to kind of move out of view and would be used periodically. A heroic exception to that was Tim Harrington, the kind of crusading journalist and MP, who of course was a good friend of James Joyce's father.
He wrote the letter.
Yes, that's right. I wrote the letter, a reference letter when Joyce was leaving Ireland, in fact. But I think one of the things, again, Marion, I was able to find in the archives was the kind of heroic local people who continued to write petitions all through the succeeding 20 years, particularly to try to secure release for the men in prison. So the local parish priest, for example, and other kind of figures who were illiterate wrote petitions and memorials. Miles Joyce's nephew, the young boy Thomas, learned to read and write in English while in prison. So you can see after a particular period of time, he's actually able to write petitions and memorials on his own behalf. And again, a sort of family story, which I think is very powerful, is that he only was allowed to send a certain number of petitions. So he did a trade whereby he sacrificed a visit from a local politician in order to have the right to send another petition. So there again, I suppose the kind of lost stories of those men in prison. And I suppose just to finish on that, the 3 men who survived prison, 2 of them died in jail, and they came back in 1902 to the community where they were cheek by jowl, so to speak, with the prosecution witnesses who had lied about them, with the men who had testified against them, and were in many ways broken men. So the brokenness of the family really is very powerful there as well. It's a long answer, Maria.
Quick question over here. There's a mic coming.
James Joyce worked for Berlin's, a foreign language teaching company. I'm just wondering if they farmed out Irish minority languages in those days, or was the idea that you learn a major language? But even today, I wonder if they've gotten into a situation where they will, if you want to learn Irish or Welsh, they'll get someone to teach that to you. Do you know that?
Well, I think one of the important differences is my grandmother from upstate New York was a native Welsh speaker from Rome, New York. That's because the Welsh church used the Welsh language as a language of religion, whereas of course the Catholic Church in the 19th and indeed throughout the 20th century used Latin. So that was certainly one of those areas where Irish is been poorly served by the church.
While I had the microphone, I had a quick question back for Jim about the case in Bavaria. Were you provided with an interpreter? Tell us a bit more about how that worked. Yeah.
It's complicated. And I don't want to go into it at too great depth because I don't want to distract from the case at hand. If only to say that much is lost in translation whenever information is being translated, and questions in court are asked in a language that solicits the answer in advance. So I had perfectly fine representation, and I blocked all this out now. I've never spoken about this publicly. But I'm just painfully aware, reading your book, about, look, I'm a tenured professor when I was going through this experience of English and comparative literature. I'm as well placed as anyone. Just try to imagine the experience of an injured boy who's lost his family, who's being peppered with questions. And do you know the consequence of lying? Who knows the consequence of lying in court? Is it perjury? Is it hell? I mean, who even knows what the boy was thinking at that moment? So I'm in a privileged position, but I'm very much aware of those who are not. And, I'm up here on a panel. We're all more or less experienced in speaking in public. The terror of somebody who has never been forced to speak in a public setting before cannot be underestimated.
So when I was looking for a way to shorten my introductory remarks, I caught one line from yours, which is that book, which turns out to also a way to be so relevant and interesting today. I was struck in reading the book by the ability of witnesses to recognize people wearing blackface. And so the prosecution, because they had to do something with that evidence, right, they had to suppress it. So it might be another opportunity for Shakespeare. But I wondered seriously, when you look at the transcripts, can you read them as tragedy? I mean, at the level of form, or do you get at them that way? And now I'm interested with Colin. Some of this is in the book, but I'd like to hear more. How did James Joyce become interested, and what did he do with it? Because he did something at school. Well, maybe he always does.
I'll just speak.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'll just speak briefly to that.
They can't hear you, I'm sorry. I can hear the back, if you don't mind.
Press the button.
There we go, sorry. One of the things that's taken me 40 years to do is read if you will, a transcript of a Shakespeare play, which is merely a transcript of a realized production, and try to imagine how many people are engaged in any single scene. And when you read Margaret's book, you'll read the question of the prosecution and the boy's response. What's invisible is the translator. And of course, it's that's not in the transcript of the trial. The translator is gone. And to me, the drama of that moment, if you will, the tragedy of that moment, is what we used to call in second grade the game of telephone, where one person is talking to another and passing on information. So I have to recreate, as I'm reading the transcript that Margaret's editing and providing at this moment, and then flesh out what the scene in court actually was. The experience of the young man, the frustration of the court, the inability of the translator to move the court in a particular direction. That's where the real drama of this case is, and it would make a remarkable play.
The information came to Joyce, I presume, in three ways. One, as Margaret makes this very clear in the book, that his father was a friend of Tim Harrington's. Tim Harrington had written the pamphlet. Tim Harrington was the one who wrote him the letter to James Joyce when he was going to Paris. He'd been Lord Mayor of Dublin, Harrington, saying he was a good egg and he should look after him, he was a good scholar. So that Harrington would have been a close friend of the family, even though the father fell out with everybody. But until he did, he was a close friend. The second one is that Nora Barnacle came from Galway, and that this really would have loomed very large in anyone's imagination. It was a great story to tell. The third thing is that it happened in 1882 to a Joyce. And Joyce was fascinated by these sort of coincidences. So there are three ways the story would have come to him. The story is really interesting, as Margaret's book makes clear, in that it shows us so much about other things, about the nature of the bilingual question and the nature of the relationship with Ireland and England, the nature of the law. So many other things this throws light on them. And this throws light on the politics of James Joyce, because in that essay written in 1907, there's great uncertainty at the core of it as to who he is and where he comes from politically. So if you're trying to pin James Joyce down politically, this essay makes clear, it's a short essay, how he really will not become clear. He's cosmopolitan for 1 second, he's outside all of this. But then he's a fierce Irish nationalist in the middle. And then at the very end, he comes to a similar case he talks about in a place called Great Worley in England, where there was a miscarriage of justice involving a man called George Edalji. George Edalji, who was he was charged and he was convicted of maiming cattle, and it was clear in the aftermath that he wasn't. And it is as though Joyce, having been so ferociously Irish nationalist for 1 second, realizes this is a more complicated story than anyone thinks. There are many miscarriages of justice. They take place in many different ways. And it's as though he's softening his own cough for a moment as he comes to the end of his essay, written, of course, for a publication that is fiercely nationalist against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, irredentist in favor of the Italian side. So that, this case allows us to see Joyce in a number of different lights. It's a case, I think, that everyone who comes to it, possibly even including you, that you actually show something about yourself as you work on it.
That's right. And just one very brief footnote to that is that Joyce returns to it in Finnegan's Wake then.
Oh yeah, you're right, yeah.
And there's a sort of making amends, because Miles Joyce, and actually Crumb's description of the essay as wavering is absolutely perfect, but one of the wavering moments is that he describes Miles Joyce, the term in ebetito is the term he uses in kind of Trieste Italian. It's translated as kind of dumbfounded. But in Finnegan's Wake, he comes back to this. And actually in the Festy King episode of Finnegan's Wake, Festy King is exonerated and found innocent. So but it's fascinating that, all those decades later, it's a case that's still troubling him.
Yeah. waving at the back. Right at the back.
Yeah, no, I just wanted, since we keep talking about issues of translation and comedy and theater and tragedy, and having gone to the Lady Gregory exhibition and Untitled together at the National New York Public Library last night, it really occurred to me that like Lady Gregory was right on these things, right? These questions of misapprehensions that have really high stakes. And the fact that she was working in tragicomedy, right? The idea that like it was a form that was in both, and that can capture sort of the comedy and the tragedy that you guys keep returning to. So the notion that this genre, right, and this way of thinking about bilingualism with stakes wasn't strictly a legal or historical matter, right? But it actually is percolating through those early Abbey plays, particularly those of Lady Gregory, right? She was all over this. I just thought it was really, and not necessarily a question, it's more an observation, but it's right there.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and warmly recommend the exhibition for anyone who hasn't seen it yet in New York Public Library. Maureen, you've of course worked on her acquisition of Irish, and again, I think that for this audience, indeed myself included, the acquisition of Irish is an important, concept.
Yeah, she decided she wanted to learn the Irish language.
She had a nursemaid when she was a girl. She grew up in a very Protestant Anglo-Irish family, not very intellectual at all, but she had a nursemaid, Mary Sheridan, who taught her a little bit of Irish, and then when she was married to Sir William Gregory at Cool, she decided she wanted to learn Irish, and she went down to the gatehouse, and the gate man helped her with Irish, and we still have in the Berg collection. Now, the exhibition, it doesn't show that material, but it is in the Berg collection, all of these penny notebooks where she actually worked her way through O'Grony's simple lessons in Irish and that sort of thing. So she collected, but she was a fairly good linguist, and so she collected in Irish, and she very much admired the work of the Irish poet Raftery, as you know. But it's a very good point. I wanted to just mention, not only to see the Lady Gregory exhibition, but I know the Irish Rep is doing Lady Gregory's Plays and Whispers, and it's been extended till March 29th, and that's certainly worth seeing. Yeah.
Thanks, it's been a great presentation. I just wanted to add to what Colin said about James Joyce's ambivalence, because it gives me a chance to repeat my favorite quote from Ulysses, which is, "Spring forth my booklet quick, to greet the callous public, rid Tyrene 'twas not my wish, in lean, unlovely English." I'd also like to say I'm sitting next to a native Irish speaker, and he bears no stigma.
One last question, and then after that, I don't know if anybody is thirsty, but I'm parched. We will have a reception downstairs. Let's take one last question.
Not a question.
A comment?
Yeah, the people who are interested in Lady Gregory.
Let's get the mic so we can hear you. Yeah.
For the people who are interested in Lady Gregory, one of the best little books is called Lady Gregory's Toothbrush by Colin Tobey.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, panel, for a wonderful afternoon. Please join us downstairs.
And the books are downstairs.
Oh yeah. And the book is downstairs. Did you hear that?